There are houses that seem to breathe in winter, where every gust through the corridors sounds like memory trying to speak. Merrowvale Hall was one of them. On nights when the wind screamed across the moors and the snow pressed against its stone bones, the candles flickered as if remembering something the living had forgotten. And if you believe that love can survive silence, that duty can smother the heart until it nearly forgets how to beat, then make sure to like and subscribe, because this story is for those who've ever stayed too long in a love that hurt, waiting for a fall that may never come. For 6 winters, Lady Evelyn Carden had been called the Duchess by servants, tenants, even strangers, all assuming that her place beside the Duke of Merrowvale was bound by more than mere affection. But in truth, no vows had ever been spoken between them. She was mistress of the household, keeper of his mother's ledgers, silent partner in every charitable account, yet she remained only his intended, the engagement suspended in a frost as old as their grief. It had begun, as such things do, with love bright enough to melt every rule of propriety. She had been the daughter of a viscount with a mind too sharp and a spirit too independent for London's narrow ballrooms, and he, Sebastian Ashcombe, heir to one of the oldest dukedoms in the north, had been a man still laughing easily, still unburdened by duty. They had danced once beneath the glass dome of the Ashcombe Winter Ball, and before the next season's snow had fallen, their betrothal was announced. Yet that same winter, his elder brother, the first Duke, Jonathan, died in a duel fought over a debt of honor, leaving Sebastian with a title, an estate, and a guilt that settled into his bones like ice. After the funeral, the wedding was postponed until the household was out of mourning, and somehow that mourning never ended. Now, 6 winters later, Evelyn's days at Merrowvale passed like pages in a book she had read too often. Morning tea before the great window that overlooked the frozen lake. Letters to tenants in need of firewood. A slow descent to dinner, where Sebastian would speak of estate matters with the same careful neutrality one might reserve for a business partner. He was never cruel, merely absent, as though his mind lived in a season that no longer touched the earth. And yet sometimes, she would catch him watching her in the candlelight, his expression unreadable, as though remembering something he wished he could forget. To the outside world, their companionship appeared serene, 2 figures in a portrait of old nobility, but within the marble halls, silence was the third inhabitant, and it was louder than any storm. Then came the night of the blizzard. It began with a sudden blackening of the sky and the smell of iron in the air, that peculiar scent that always came before snow on the moors. By dusk, the roads were impassable. Guests who were expected for the holiday season sent word they could not travel, and the staff hurried to shutter every window. Evelyn, standing in the east corridor, watched as the first flakes struck the glass like white ash. When Sebastian entered, the lamplight carved his features into angles, older, sterner than the boy she had once loved. "The storm will trap us for days," he said quietly, his breath clouding in the chill air. "Perhaps longer." She merely nodded, though part of her heart thrilled at the thought, 6 days alone with him, the Duke who would not wed her. Perhaps, she told herself, confinement might for what 6 years of civility had frozen. But when the wind began to howl and the servants retired early to their quarters, the house seemed to draw closer around them, and it was not warmth that filled it, but something heavier, something like unfinished confession. That night, unable to sleep, Evelyn walked the darkened corridors, her candle trembling in its holder. Passing the long gallery, she noticed that one of the portrait drapes had been disturbed, the old velvet cover that shrouded the late Duke's likeness. Curiosity overcame propriety, and she drew it back. Jonathan Ashcombe's painted eyes stared down, alive with the arrogance of youth. But what caught her breath was the ring on his painted hand, her ring, the emerald signet Sebastian had promised her 6 years ago, one he'd never explained losing. Her fingers tightened on the candlestick as she remembered that first engagement dinner, how Jonathan had toasted their union with 2 bright eyes, how Sebastian's smile had faltered for only a heartbeat. She turned sharply at the sound of a door creaking open, and there he was, Sebastian himself, standing in the shadows like the ghost of his own guilt. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice roughened by more than sleep. "That portrait, it should have stayed covered." His gaze flicked to the emerald glint on the painted hand, and for the first time, Evelyn saw something close to fear in him. "Whose ring was it first?" she asked, though she already dreaded the answer. He didn't reply. Only the firelight, guttering from a distant sconce, caught the wet shine in his eyes. "Some truths," he murmured, should stay buried with the dead. But as the storm screamed beyond the windows and the house groaned under its weight, Evelyn realized that the dead were not the only ones haunting Merrowvale. For 6 winters she had been his Duchess in name, but that night, as snow erased every road out of the valley, she vowed that before spring came, she would uncover what secret bound him to the ghost of the man whose ring she might have worn first. By morning, the storm had buried Merrowvale beneath a world of white, drifts as high as the stone terrace, trees bowed under the weight of ice, and a silence so absolute it felt like the breath between heartbeats. Evelyn woke to that hush and felt, for the first time in years, that something in the air had shifted. At breakfast, the Duke appeared without his usual veneer of indifference. There were dark crescents beneath his eyes, the look of a man who had wrestled ghosts until dawn. He spoke little, but when he did, his voice had softened, the edges dulled by exhaustion or something deeper. All through the day they crossed paths, in the library, in the great hall, by the fire where the storm had cracked the flue so that the smoke drifted low and fragrant with pine. He watched her as she read, as though weighing some decision that had haunted him too long. When twilight fell, he appeared again, this time at her sitting room door, without pretense or purpose. "You were right to ask," he said quietly, closing it behind him. "About the ring." He crossed the room, each word deliberate, as though confessing to something that might undo him. "It was his first," he said, meaning Jonathan. "Before I was ever to have it made for you." The admission hung between them like frost. Evelyn rose, her pulse unsteady. "Then he proposed," Sebastian finished, his tone raw. "To you, once. And when you refused him, he challenged the man who dared to love you next." Her hand flew to her throat. "The jewel?" "It was for you," he said bitterly. "But not out of honor. Out of jealousy and pride. He lost, and I inherited everything that was his, title, estate, shame, and the woman he could not win." He looked at her then, not as a dupe, but as a man laid bare. "How could I take you for my wife knowing I had taken his life's worth as well?" For years she had imagined him cold from nature, but now she saw it, the prison built from guilt, the tenderness buried alive beneath duty. "And did you ever ask what I lost?" she whispered. "You left me in a half-life, not wife, not widow, merely a rumor at your table." The wind rattled the windows as if echoing her heart. He turned away, jaw taut. "I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting your remorse," she answered, the truth trembling in her voice. He froze, and then, almost against his will, laughed, the low, broken sound of someone realizing how long he'd been wrong. 6 winters, he said, shaking his head. 6 winters of penance that never healed anyone. When he looked back at her, the mask had fallen completely. "Do you think forgiveness is possible, Evelyn?" She met his gaze, steady, unwavering. "It isn't forgiveness you need, Sebastian. It's courage." For a long moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. Then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fire reflected in his eyes, not the distant gray of ice, but something alive again. "I remember," he said softly, "the night I first called you Duchess. You wore emerald silk. You laughed when I promised you forever. I have kept every promise except that one." His hand rose, hesitated, then fell, not from rejection, but reverence. "If I could go back," she stopped him with a whisper. "You cannot go back. But you can stop standing still." Outside, the wind began to ease. Somewhere deep in the walls, a beam cracked, and snow slid from the roof in a soft, distant collapse, the sound of pressure breaking, the sound of release. And in that moment, she realized that something in him had shifted too. The storm had not destroyed Merrowvale. It had simply stripped it bare. As the fire dimmed, Sebastian reached for her hand, his voice barely audible. "Then let it end, the mourning, the silence, the years between us." She did not answer with words, only closed her fingers around his, a fragile, trembling bridge across the winters that had kept them apart. Neither of them noticed the snow still falling outside, slower now, softer, the world remade in white, as if blessing the fall that had begun at last. When the fall came to Merrowvale, it came slowly, not in the sudden blaze of spring, but in the quiet dripping of icicles along the eaves, in the faint scent of earth waking beneath the frost. The household stirred with it. Curtains were drawn wide again, fires burned less fiercely, and even the servants walked with a lighter step, as though the long silence that had ruled their lives was finally breaking. Yet for Evelyn and Sebastian, the true thaw had begun not in the world around them, but in the fragile warmth that had grown between them since that night of confession. He no longer lingered behind the barricade of his study. He met her at breakfast, spoke of the future, not of duties or debts, but of travel, restoration, laughter. Still, Evelyn held herself apart, not from bitterness but from the knowledge that forgiveness, once given, could not be taken back. One evening, when the first crocuses pushed through the snow in the courtyard, she stood before the great window and said quietly, "You have to let him go, Sebastian. Not just in words, but in the life you live." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded, and she saw in that small motion the breaking of a chain 6 years forged. But healing, like winter's retreat, was never complete without one final storm. It arrived not from the sky, but in the form of a letter, delivered by a messenger from London, the late Duke's private journals, discovered among estate papers newly settled. That night, by the fire, Sebastian read the entries aloud at a voice rough with disbelief. Jonathan had written not of honor or love, but of envy, of scheming to ruin his brother's happiness, of provoking the duel himself after learning of Evelyn's engagement to Sebastian. He knew, she whispered, staring into the flames. He knew it was his own doing. Sebastian closed the journal slowly. All these years I carried his guilt, and it was never mine to bear. The firelight flickered against his face, revealing both sorrow and release. He stole 6 winters from us, Evelyn said softly. Let us not give him a 7th. In the weeks that followed, she saw a new man emerge, not the brooding Duke of Duty, nor the broken one of remorse, but someone closer to the man she had first loved beneath the Ashcombe dome, laughing freely, unguarded at last. And yet, when he finally knelt before her in the quiet of the chapel, where sunlight fell in golden shafts through ancient glass, his words were not the triumphant declarations of a man reclaiming what was lost, but the humble plea of one asking to begin anew. "Evelyn Carden," he said, his voice unsteady but true, "you have been my conscience, my compass, my torment, and my peace. For 6 winters I called you Duchess, but never wife. Will you allow me to make that right?" Her answer came with tears that were not sorrow, but release. "I was yours before the frost," she whispered, "and I am yours still, but this time, let it be in the sun." Their wedding was held a week later, quiet, unannounced, witnessed only by the chapel's aging vicar and the snowdrops blooming at the windows. No carriages lined the drive, no guests spilled from the doors. Yet the bells rang across the valley with a clarity that carried farther than any announcement in the Times. In London, society would hear rumors, would question and scoff, would write its columns of disbelief. But none of that reached the moors. At Merrowvale, spring crept in without ceremony, the lake thawed, the fields greened, and the great house, once haunted by grief, filled at last with music and laughter. Sometimes, on evenings when the light softened to gold, Evelyn would stand beside her husband on the terrace and he would take her hand, calling her Duchess still, but this time with a smile, and with the ring that was hers alone glinting on her finger. For 6 winters, she had waited to be seen, to be chosen not from duty, but from love. And when it came quietly, like spring itself, late, unexpected, but utterly certain.